Macdonald wrote to the Prime Minister in July of 1919 as follows: Fear is the only agency that can be successfully employed to keep the enemy aliens within the law. And I have no doubt that if the Dominion government persists in the course that it is now adopting, then the foreign element here will soon be as gentle, as easily controlled as a lot of sheep.
It's hard to believe that this beautiful area held men against their will. There is that barbed wire disease. And I think it would be a very difficult thing for anybody to be stuck in that situation and not have some play on how long is this going to be. Why did they intern families and children? These are innocent people. They didn't do anything wrong. Why did it happen to them? It changed everybody's lives. This idea of not talking about things in families, you know, it's that shame. No, they didn't do anything wrong, but they felt like they did, and they were treated like they had done something wrong. This crippling legacy, I still see it today.
Many, many people probably went to the graves not telling their family that they were interned.
Okay, and it goes out where?
If you look right here, you can follow it.
Oh, wow. Unbelievable. Location. When you step foot in this cemetery, you realize there's a bigger story. Historians have mined the archives, and there isn't a lot of new information that we're going to find. I think coming in as an archaeologist, we can excavate and look at the material record and look at a number of things. The great thing about cans is that you can date them based on the rim, whether it's a rolled rim or it's been soldered, and also the numbering on the top of it, which I'm going to photograph and take back and look up. By looking into the material culture record, we can actually tell a different side of the story and look at it from a minority group and tell it from their perspective. We decided to use a ground-penetrating radar for determining what's beneath the surface. And in doing so, we have noted 20 probable burials in this cemetery. 7 of them are clustered around the POW graves, while the remaining 13 seem to be a little bit more in the northeastern end of the cemetery. These particular graves are fascinating to me because they are just talking to the fact that these prisoners were not military POWs. They were civilians, and they should not have been here.
When you look at the other families that are in that cemetery, they're all in the standard rows, 6 by 10 is your standard sort of graveside, and they're all in nice rows. These ones weren't. So that indicates that the prisoners themselves probably dug the hole for their comrades that went into those graves.
When you read through the archives or when history is spoken about, we're never telling the side of the minority groups that were here. We're not speaking about the oppressed groups. And this is giving voice to these individuals who have been essentially forgotten about.
The honourable member for Dauphin to end the debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And during the First World War, between 1914 and 1920, over 5,000 Ukrainian Canadians were interned, basically put in prison camps. That's another word. Internment is kind of a kind word for prison camp. And that over 80,000 Ukrainian Canadians were asked to register like common criminals and report monthly to the police. That's almost unbelievable that an event of this nature would have happened in this country, a country that promotes freedom of speech, promotes democracy, yet we treat our pioneers of Ukrainian descent in that manner. It's shameful, and that's why their story has to be told.
This excerpt is taken from an archive that's called The Calgary Herald and the Settlement of the Ukrainians in Canada. We are prepared to offer a hearty welcome to men of races and all creeds. English, Irish, Scotch, French, German, Norwegian, Icelander, Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, or Mennonite. Settlements of separate nationalities may not be ideal settlement at first, but we must trust to time to bring about a fusion of races. All we should ask in regard to immigrants and settlers is, are they healthy, industrious, and moral living? If they fill the bill, they will be received with open hands and open hearts, without difficulty. The Daily Herald of Calgary, January 21st, 1892.
There was an entire prehistory of hostility towards Ukrainian immigrants in Canada. These people had come to Canada on the invitation of the Canadian government. They had come as stalwart settlers who were able to open up the western frontiers of Canada.
Just prior to our First World War, there was a recession. And the recession resulted in a lot of job loss. And so these people that were invited to Canada to be laborers, to be farmers, some of them lost their jobs. When World War I broke out, they were welcomed immigrants and some naturalized citizens. They became enemies of the state.
On this invitation says that there's 160 acres available for every settler. That would have enticed anybody if somebody promised me that. They said there was 200 million acres available. That's a pretty big statement.
As a 19-year-old Canadian, I was deeply moved by the fact that immigrants who had come to Canada in good faith were treated poorly. They were distrusted, they were treated in a very bad way, in some cases with extremely detrimental consequences. My sole purpose was to try to put a human face on that history, to say that indeed these were individuals, human beings who came to Canada in good faith and deserved better than what they received in the end.
The War Measures Act was promulgated on August 22nd of 1914, 18 days after Canada entered the war.
One could come to the conclusion that there was a clear intention in terms of dealing with enemy aliens, given the timing of the passing of the War Measures Act.
There were about 88,000 civilians that had to report to the local authorities, and that could be the local police, the local Northwest Mounted Police.
The registration system was set up because there was so many new immigrants or families like mine that were naturalized, but there were farmers out in the prairies. They obviously didn't have enough of a system set up to intern over 80,000 people, and they needed the grain off the farms. They needed the farmers to be farming. So their method was registering these people and keeping track of their whereabouts by these registration cards, and having the local authorities making sure that they were documented and monitored. The registration card is a tiny little piece of paper. Actually says on it that the bearer must carry this card with them at all times or face internment. So, I mean, they knew how important was not to lose this little piece of paper.
I've heard stories from others where officials demanded monetary payment to get their documents stamped.
And if they didn't have the money, then they would intern them. Where did farmers have the money to pay a monthly bribe if it was $2 a month to get their card stamped?
My grandfather died in 1967. He would talk about having been put in prison by Canada for something that he hadn't done. But we didn't really anticipate that this was what he meant by a prison. We thought that it was a jail. One day, when he went to get his papers stamped, instead of stamping his papers and saying, "Go back to your homestead," they arrested him. And I think that the reason was there was a mandate to set up parks across the country. And so when they saw someone like my grandfather, they just decided that he was a good prospect and he was the wrong nationality, so let's take him in. He just happened to be a necessary commodity to the government. His rights didn't come into it at all.
Jobs were scarce, so you had especially single men who were living in cities who were without jobs. And one easy way for the communities to deal with the welfare problem was to suggest to the federal government that these people were a danger to Canada, so they should go into the concentration camp.
It was the first formal suspension of civil liberties in Canada.
A lot of it was just simply witch hunting. People just didn't like these new people, and they just would make up a story just to get them sent away.
My father, who got interned and spent some time here in Banff, he came over here in 1914 with a friend, took up a homestead, and started farming. In 1916, he was having a beer with Max at the hotel, and something was said that wasn't proper, I guess. And Dad can't recall what was said. That's when they picked him up and took him to Banff. Well, in Banff, he says they put him into a small, dark room that you couldn't turn around, you couldn't see, you couldn't do anything. They told him that if you're ready to start splitting some rocks, you can get out. Well, he didn't like this dark little room, so he said, "Yep, I'll get out." And he says, "We were always hungry, and we stole potatoes from the hogs and ate that." He also said, "There isn't a live cat around the camp. They all went for stew." Dad had made a chip inside of a bottle out of bones. When he was being released, the man in charge wouldn't let him take it through, but said he'd keep it. My dad tells me the next thing he did was throw it on the floor and traveled on it. He said, "I wasn't going to put all that work in for nothing."
The term concentration camp came from the Boer War, and it was the concentration of people. And so the Canadian government used that term. Now, of course, World War II put quite the negative spin with the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, and current word is internment, but the term of the day was concentration camp. There were roughly 8,500 people that were interned. Out of that 8,500, it was 5,500 were civilians, and the rest were either German or Austrian soldiers. And the 5,500 civilians were Croatians, Serbians, Bulgarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Ottoman Turks, Ottoman Alevi Kurds, Armenians, but the majority were Ukrainian.
I learned about how thousands of Ukrainians and other Europeans were unjustly imprisoned in 24 Canadian internment camps, not because of any wrong they had done, but only because of who they were, where they had come from.
Relating to Otter's report, there were 2 particular camps that are listed incorrectly. They actually had to move these camps along. And there's all these little camps that now we're finding were dotted along there. It makes sense to move them with the project as they were moving forward on the roads. So we know that there were a lot more than there was 24 internment camps.
The 1907 Hague Convention stipulated that prisoners of war could not be used for work more than their own upkeep. So cutting wood to keep the fires warm, cooking for your fellow POWs, that was allowed. And the Germans and Austrians, that was the case for them. They were considered first class. The civilian POWs were not considered first class and were used for multiple work projects across Canada.
They'd get up early in the morning, before it was even light. They would assemble in the main area of the camp, and they'd be counted to see whether anyone had been missing over the night. And they would be marched out under armed guard. Where they were marched out to, there'd be hardly room to step. There were so many trees. And then they would end up just staying in that place, cutting trees by hand with axes. And we know that they stuffed their boots with newspaper because they were not insulated. And even in the barracks, wind would just blow through the cracks. Takes you back 100 years ago. It's already freezing cold. And to think of these men here, dressed poorly, without enough food to eat, and being forced to do slave labor. One thing that my grandfather said that he learned how to do was to carry a log on his shoulder and run. It had ended up completely ruining his back. And so by the time he was 60, he was pretty much not able to do very much. He couldn't even farm anymore. He had to retire from farming. But, you know, it was what they had all learned how to do, was to carry a giant log and to run.
You know, people that were not supposed to work as prisoners were forced to work. And if you didn't work, you suffered for it. There were consequences. I think it hurt the families of the people that were interned, because there were women and children interned in Vernon, British Columbia, and in Spirit Lake, northern Quebec.
Where I'm standing now is probably about where the single men's barracks were standing. Walking through here, I often think, how many times did my grandfather cross this area, or my grandmother, going to get water, going to the hospital. Picture going back 100 years, what it must have been like. You didn't have the clothing we have now, and working out here day in and day out. It's sort of something that is hard to comprehend, that it happened in Canada. The place that I'm walking right now is about where the stone wall was that's shown in many of the pictures. In this picture, my grandmother is holding my mother, who was born in the camp, and my Uncle Edward would have been about 2 years old at the time, just standing beside her. The barn that you see in the photograph is still behind me. The stone that was on the wall was taken down and was used to build a church. Families were housed in one area, and the single men were in the swampy area because the barracks were built on stilts. It was so wet. The area right in front of us is where the men would come out every morning, muster out on parade, and they would assign them their duties, whether it was into the forest, cutting bush. Some would work in the hospital, others chop firewood, and this they had to do if they expected to get meals and eat. You did your share of the work. Imagine crossing on foot on the lake, of spending a 12-hour day in the forest, cleaning brush now, in the summer, mosquitoes, in the winter, when your clothes get wet from perspiration. And there you are coming back to a camp that's barely insulated.
At the time, these guards were making pretty good money. And that's food on their families' tables. What's wrong with that? put the shoe on the other foot. You'd do the same thing. You do what it takes to get your family through.
Memories of what my father, when I asked him about this camp, if he knew about it, and he had, because he had been told stories from his father, and he had a little bit of uneasiness of even talking about it.
There's another can, another one there, and then there's another one down through there. So our great-grandfather lived up here. He homesteaded here. He was not a prisoner in this camp. He did provide some of the commissariat for this camp.
He would have had to supply these supplies here by a team of horses. Imagine milk, eggs, anything that any of the other farmers along the way would have been able to supply as well.
Our grandmother had donated this photo to the museum. This is Irving Puckett. This is our great-grandfather, Benjamin Myers. And this is the camp commandant, Captain J.W. Clark.
It's got, look at the lumber in there. Yep. Side of an old log cabin or something?
Could be. It's just a feeling that it was wrong, what happened to all these men and women who came to Canada.
We were in a state of war. Everybody was suspicious that didn't speak English. And having them rounded up and stuck out in the middle of the nowhere and still not really understanding what they did wrong. That's the shameful part of the whole thing.
I think the suffering part of it is almost undocumented. Of what the families had to go through, the kids, you know, the human side of the event.
I guess people don't realize that the lasting effects. My great-grandmother was here in the midst of a TB epidemic. My great-grandmother had TB. My grandmother died of tuberculosis at age 32. My mother, about a year after I was born, she left the farm and went into Edmonton and spent 2 years in hospital. My sister, before she finished high school, ended up in the Aberhart TB stand in Edmonton. 4 generations suffered as a result of the camp.
When I was doing research into the internment camps, I couldn't help but think of the story of my grandmother's mother, my prababa, and what she must have gone through. She married when she was around 18. She had a new baby, and my grandmother was about 3 when her husband left Ukraine and came to Canada. When he finally sent, the fares for them to come to Canada, she had to take 2 children and cross the ocean and arrive here. Hadn't seen her husband for 4 years. Her children really didn't know their father. The pressures of that alone must have been great. And then she had to adjust to life in Canada. Just as she was adjusting to life in Canada, her husband was arrested and taken away, and he was a prisoner. My great-grandfather ended up here. This is a reconstruction of what the camp must have been like when he was held here 100 years ago. Because he was declared an unfriendly alien, he was rounded up, and according to my grandmother, her father was here from about 9 months to a year. He worked on a gang that was widening and deepening the Sioux Locks. And sometimes Algoma Steel needed laborers, and sometimes the paper mill needed laborers. And so he was forced to work there. My grandmother spoke very little of that time period, except to say that there were times where they were hungry, and my grandmother herself started to catch fish. The last street before the river, that's where my grandmother would go out onto the log booms and get a small log, and when the whitefish would come up, she'd hit them on the head and scoop them up and take them home for supper. And so she was able to provide her family with some food during times when she said if she hadn't caught any fish, they wouldn't have had anything for supper that night.
This little girl wrote a heartbreaking letter to her father's asking for him to come home because when he was home, they had food. When he was home, they had enough wood to keep the fire going in the wintertime.
My dear father, we haven't nothing to eat, and they don't want to give us no wood. My mother has to go 4 times to get something to eat. It is better with you because we had everything to eat. The shack is no good. My mother is going downtown every day, and I have to go with her. And I don't go to school at winter. It is cold in that shack. We, your small children, kiss your hands, my dear father. Goodbye, my dear father. Come home right away.
Anin, Bojo, Ogaman Nemanagojin Goyakasit, Dishnakas, Bajunang Donji, Gajak Dodem, Ishnaven and Dao. This is a very sacred, dear place to the Ojibwe people of the Central Great Lakes. We've had a sordid history in this area, including our removal from these islands back in the early 1900s, prior to the First World War. And our people were basically landless after we left here. It wasn't long after, I guess, that Canada established a prison. We understand that the pain that people experienced while they were here was based on economic needs and capitalism.
Now imagine being a 17-year-old woman, a 20-year-old woman, coming to a foreign land, having 1 child, 2, maybe 3 children at a young age, while your husband's imprisoned. Where do you go? To whom do you turn? What do you do?
She took in boarders. She bootlegged to make extra money. Who knows what a woman would be able to do in those circumstances? She wanted to provide for her family, provide for her children. This is my prababa, my great-grandmother, Nastya. She's the one who came from Ukraine with her daughters. This is Katie, her oldest daughter. And these are the 2 girls, Mary and Anne, who were born in Canada. There is another sister, Lena, who is not in the photo because she died just before this. She slid on the ice and broke her hip, and peritonitis set in. And so yet another source of stress for Nastya in all of the things that were happening in her life. I think that having a husband who was removed from the family unit forcibly, leaving them without an income, in a day and age where women didn't work, was a contributing factor to her becoming an alcoholic. It's hard to judge someone when you know that there were contributing factors like the internment that intervened in their lives and turned them in a whole different direction. My great-grandmother was arrested, and then she was brought to jail. A result of that was the Children's Aid removed the 2 younger girls from the house. It's a very sad era of our family life. And it's no wonder that neither my grandmother nor my mother really talked about Nastia Corny because she wasn't a shining example for a family.
Look now at these summer cottages and this new development. You know, up through here was where all the summer camp, the tents were here along the beach. This site here was one of the 24 internment camps of Canada, where they, you know, held men against their will.
Nous sommes présentement sur les lieux où se situait le camp d'internement de la milice de Valcartier en 1915. Puis avec la carte qui est superposée, on le voit ici aussi, là. Donc, le camp était en face de ça, pas très loin. Puis la marque ici rouge qu'on voit, ça se retrouve à être le bâtiment blanc. Tout ici, le contour, bien, ça se trouve à être le barbelé qui était autour du camp, juste ici. Puis on peut remarquer qu'il y avait des tentes qui habitaient dans ça, les gens. Un peu froid au mois d'octobre ou au mois d'avril. À l'époque, il y avait 2 grandes tours d'eau à l'arrière. Le photographe a pris sa photo de ces tours-là. C'est pour ça qu'on voit les montagnes comme ça. Dans le camp, puis on ferait face aux montagnes. Il y a un morceau de béton, mais je ne sais pas c'est quoi. Ah, I found another one. J'en ai trouvé un autre plaque ici. C'est tout ce qui reste.
106 of them in the internment camp operations did go mentally insane. And I think it would be a very difficult thing for anybody to be stuck in that situation and not knowing, am I ever going to be free again?
Why were they in prison? Why were they in this concentration camp? It was no fault of their own. It's not what they did, it's where they were born or what passport they came with.
I can imagine, you know, some guys after a hard day's labor are wondering literally, what the hell are they doing here? And how can they get across there? And is that the channel to freedom? And at what point can they just literally swim across this lake and head out to the bush and be gone?
Right from the inception, prisoners were dedicating themselves to escape from the camps. They felt that it was an unjust imposition on themselves, and many of them did everything they could to escape from the camps.
The story ends rather tragically in one instance, we're in the North Shore of Lake Superior, where the individual is being transported from Western Canada to Kapuskasing, and he saw this opportunity to flee and leapt from the train. Scouts were sent out in search of this individual and could not find him. What you learn later from reports is that this individual ultimately found less than what he had bargained for. They found a frozen corpse. He had died in the bush.
They felt that they were there without proper reasoning, without proper justification, and they took every effort that they could make to get out of the camps.
In 1916, after a summer of working on the roads and the railway, that the internees were so desperate to escape that they started to dig a tunnel. And on September 28th of that year, the tunnel was discovered, and it was only 8 feet from the bush and from their freedom.
It's very possible that the escape tunnel has been located. We have found a hole that is shored up in a very similar manner that escape tunnels are. However, it does appear to be collapsed a little bit, and it hasn't been safe to go in. It's a complete straight line with no tree coverage, which could possibly note the tunneling underneath here.
They were up in a remote area, and there weren't any barbed wire fences where he was. And he just took the opportunity, and he ran out, and he just kept on running, and one of the camp guards shot at him. And the bullets whizzed past his ear. They didn't hit him, but he did escape, and he went into hiding for a couple years. He changed his name.
I've met internee descendants whose parents, after being interned, went through the formal legal process of changing their surnames so that they would have another name going forward. And is that because they were ashamed at their Ukrainian surname? Is that because they were jailed for being Ukrainian and they just wanted to blend in quicker?
Part of the reason survivors didn't talk about it was they were still in fear. They never gave me back what they took from me, and then they released me. Am I going to stand up and start yelling at the government? Of course not.
They were scared. You know, they ran from oppression in Europe under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and here they were being oppressed in Canada, a so-called free country. I saw a report by the American government stating that the Canadian community was still afraid of the barbed wire in the 1930s up to the Second World War.
The big piece of advice that my grandfather always told his children was that whatever you do outside the house, do not have the police come to our door. And if the police do come, don't answer it. Pretend nobody's home. And so for my father, who actually ended up becoming an RCMP officer for over 20 years, this was a huge revelation for him because he finally realized, you know, what had been missing in his life, this sense of tradition, culture, continuity. And it was very emotional for both him and me.
One of the more tragic parts of the history is what it did to the Ukrainian-Canadian psyche, to self-consciousness about who they were as a people. And many people deliberately tried to assimilate, change their names, stop speaking the language, stop going to Ukrainian churches, stop celebrating their religious and cultural traditions because they were afraid of this xenophobia, of being the bohunks, of being the peasants in sheepskin coats, being the enemy aliens. And that had a tremendous psychological impact to that wave of Ukrainians. And that's something that, you know, many are still struggling with.
I feel that loss because I don't have that. So it's something that we're trying to reclaim, but I mean, for me, it's tough because that line was severed. You know, my father doesn't really remember a whole bunch of things that they did as a family. I mean, they were just trying to survive, right? For my grandfather, it was such a traumatic experience. I think he just wanted to blend in. He wanted to leave it behind. Let's not cause suspicion. Let's not stand out. Let's not be different. And I think there was a real sense of those things didn't help him. They actually contributed to his internment. So, you know, I think he thought they were not just useless, they were actually harmful, those cultural traditions.
When I speak with internee descendants' families and I meet them and I talk to them, there are families that have known about this, have known that it happened to their family. Those are the families that, and descendants that I find are bitter and angry because they saw, because of internment, what happened to their parent. And then that affected their life and growing up. And then there's those families that didn't know about it. And you find out afterwards. And there's denial. And then there's that anger that comes in, that shock that the Canadian government did this. This happened.
Baba never talked about
the internment camp until very, very late in life. The thing is, when she wanted to talk about the internment camp, well, she didn't have any memories. She was still so small. She was only a couple of months old when they were interned. So all her life, she knew something happened. She knew something had happened, but she had no proof. And she didn't even have the name of the internment camp.
Even my generation, I'm a first-generation descendant. I find it hard to imagine. So I can imagine my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren couldn't really picture anything like it.
People were traumatized. You know, they wanted a better life for their kids. They didn't want their kids to suffer what they did, this discrimination, this prejudice that they underwent. They didn't do anything against Canada.
I asked my father, who was born and raised in Vernon, did you ever hear about the internment camp? Never heard about it. I said, you never heard anything from your family? Not a word. I mean, it was, 14 kids in their family, and nobody had ever heard about the internment.
They were at the morning mass on a Sunday. The RCMP gathered round, herded them, basically brought them here near the train station, so it's very, very close. So we see it was easy for them to deport them to Spirit Lake. Seeing this building for the first time today and learning that it's going to be demolished, I find it's typical of the whole Ukrainian First World War story, in that it's a puzzle. Every time you're trying to learn something about the story, and all of a sudden it disappears.
One of the problems that we've had with this is that in the 1950s, the Archives of Canada destroyed the records dealing with internment, so that we lost the ability to tell a complete and full story of every one. Their excuse apparently was that nobody's ever going to be interested in those records.
My dad, being a former RCMP officer, went to find documents, and he was told they were destroyed. And he was very frustrated with that. He thought that maybe because of his service, he would be able to find more. He didn't find anything substantial. His impression was that it was deliberately done.
The effort it's taken to get even to this point of telling this story. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. And you think of the heartbreak, the fear, the confusion that was here. Sometimes it almost makes you want to cry to think that this happened.
A young fellow that spent his summer in Ottawa, actually with the Governor General's guards, was interested in this, and in his free time he went to the National Archives of Canada to see what he could find. He gave me documents talking about the destruction. They were debating, should they be destroyed, should they not be destroyed, and the decision was made to destroy the archives in Ottawa.
Imagine that. All of the attorneys' records were destroyed, but some nameless librarian/bureaucrat left a note in one of the files, because the file folder is still there, saying they destroyed these records so that no one would ever be able to make a claim for compensation.
There was concern that if the archives were there, that eventually the community would come back and say it was unjust. So they got rid of the evidence. I just think it just shows that someone thought that this is bad for the government to have these archives. There's no reason to destroy it.
As somebody who works in government, that we are not authorized to destroy documents. We are, in fact, obligated by law to keep them and archive them. So I can't begin to know why in the 1950s this was allowed, but let me be clear, it's not something that's authorized today. And when we look at the destruction of these archives through today's lens, it's a lot more shocking perhaps than it would have been at the time.
This is what's happened. This is Canadian history. It's the dark side of Canadian history as far as I'm concerned. But okay, just because of the dark side, why wouldn't we talk about it? There's lots of things we've done. I'm sure the other countries have done it worse than what this happened. These people are all released.
But it seems un-Canadian to want to cover something like this up. And that to me, as a proud Canadian, as a son of immigrants, that is probably the most shocking part of this whole story.
It wouldn't surprise me that there are things yet to be discovered. Because I think people realized that even though maybe they were ordered to destroy things, they knew that it was the wrong thing to do. And I'm sure that there are things in people's attics and basements that we still need to discover.
Everybody we've talked to and have learned about the First World War internment operation say that we have to speak about it to ensure that we learn from the mistakes and the tragedies of the past. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress created a Civil Liberties Commission and started a campaign to educate the government at that time, which was the Conservative government under Brian Mulroney, about the First World War internment operations.
Professor Lutuk and I had gone to see the Minister of Multiculturalism, Wiener, whose assistant said, well, you'll have to prove that this happened because, you know, these things don't happen in Canada.
I remember we met with Jerry Wiener, who was the Minister of Multiculturalism at the time, and Jerry Wiener sat as close as this lady is to me and said, it never happened.
What do you mean it didn't happen? It happened. When you deny it, and I guess I'm stubborn, you know, it changed my life.
Our job is not yet finished. The biggest battle is yet to be won, which is restitution and acknowledgement by the federal government.
This was around the same time that Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was negotiating a redress settlement with Japanese Canadians.
Good evening. Japanese Canadians will remember this as the day when Canada finally moved to right a wrong committed against them 4 decades ago.
We use the same kind of language, we use that template to try to secure something comparable for the Ukrainian Canadian community.
In November 2001, a committee was formed consisting of Dr. Lubomir Litsyuk, Paul Grod, and myself, representing 3 of the largest Ukrainian organizations involved in the internment process.
We wanted to ensure that we were inclusive and brought as many people in together. We realized that if we're going to be successful in any campaign and in any political campaign, you have to be united and speak with one voice. I was able to actually work with Andrew Lubomir, bring other parts of the community together, including the descendants.
We were always accused of being enemy aliens. How the hell can you be a Canadian and an enemy alien when you come here to build? 45 million Slavic people fought with the British, fought with the Americans, fought against German militarism and expansionism, and yet we are called aliens? Not one was charged with nothing, but locked up. And we feel that we're entitled to an apology. We're entitled that every Canadian citizen should know that we are not second-class citizens and we didn't come from the moon and we come from this planet.
During the Canadian federal election in 1993, Jean Chrétien responded, and I'll quote, "Liberals understand the complexity and significance of these issues, and should we form the next government, we will be prepared to work with the Ukrainian Canadian community to find solutions." This hasn't happened.
We were traveling down the highway, Lubomir Litsyuk and myself. And during the course of the conversation that we had, it said, wouldn't it be great to locate each site and in effect create these sites as places of memory? And it was at that moment that the idea was created ultimately of commemorating each site, of plaquing each site.
In the 1990s, the Shevchenko Foundation began providing funding for grants to the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association for the installation of internment plaques across the country.
This plaque is dedicated to the memory of the men, women, and children who were held at the Vernon internment camp on this location. So I'm standing here in the middle of a playing field, and it used to be, from 1914 to 1920, it was an internment camp. And this is where my grandparents and my uncle came. He was 3 months old at the time, but I honestly can't see how a 3-month-old baby could be a threat. My grandmother actually made friends with a lady who lived here in Vernon through the fence, and she supplied her with some milk for the baby. And I just can't imagine living like that. My uncle came here for the dedication of the plaque. He stood and looked and he said, that was the view I had for the first 6 years of my life. I had this chain link fence in between me and the rest of the world, and I wondered why? Why was I here?
When you look at the statue behind me, the statue called Why, I want you to ask why, after 80 years, the government of Canada still refuses to recognize that an injustice was done. Why must the Ukrainian Canadian community on its own resources put up monuments, statues, and plaques?
John Boxtel is an amazing sculptor, and he's done these statues across Canada. He's not connected to this story, but he's become a part of it now. It's become his legacy. These are his statues. It's personal for him. And I think it is our great honor to have such an amazing artist that has created these important pieces that will be around for many, many years.
Lubomir told me about these people having been put in a concentration camp, and they were Canadian citizens. I thought it was terrible, and I thought it was a beautiful thing he was doing. To find these camps and make some sort of a statement, I thought that was a great idea. So I said, sure, I'll do that. We made an agreement. I said, okay, I'll do it for time and material. To me, doing the sculpture was more important than the money involved. This is an armature for a figure. All the figures that I have done have been on this frame. All these bins are full of clay. And this clay I have used since 1960. And I keep this clay damp all the time because if it dries out, it's no good anymore. I enjoy doing them. And a sculptor has to produce. And it wasn't just for the sake of just producing it. The subject matter was fantastic, and I can relate to that because through the Second World War, my father was behind barbed wires. You wouldn't believe it, but this is actually the figure of a man. And actually, this was the armature for the guy in the museum in Banff. I make this in my studio, and I take it to the foundry, but they can't make a mold of the whole thing, so they cut the arm off. Then I have to put it back together, so this piece goes here, and then the hand goes on there. The one in Castle Mountain, I did it like this. What the hell did you do that for? The whole theme was asking, why did you do this to us? I really loved the woman in Spirit Lake. Huge woman, powerful woman, and she has this baby in her arm. And I thought, Jesus Christ, how can people do things like that to people?
Yeah, they're amazing. They really are. He probably wants to block out the reality of his life at this point in time. You know, probably saying, how can this be? Come to a free country and they lock us up. When I first became member of Parliament, I was invited to a plaque memorial event in Brandon, Manitoba. After the event, I said if there's any way I can help down the road, I would be more than willing to do that. What was really important was to start on a private member's bill to have it officially recognized.
We mapped out a process and realized some of the key milestones that we needed to achieve, one of which was having the recognition of the First World War internment operations enshrined in legislation. And as governments and ministers change, we had to change with the times. From the Chrétien government to the Paul Martin government, we started to work very closely with Prime Minister Martin and a number of key members of Parliament who came to realize what this internment operation was.
So I still, because we're having difficulty, we don't have a final agreement, we're still negotiating. I view this as an excellent negotiating lever into the process, because it's, you can't ignore our bill.
I'll never forget one story that Andrew Hladashowski said at a meeting with a full room of government officials. We were in Ottawa, meeting with them, talking to them about the First World War internment operations. And Andrew said to the group of them, many of them probably heard about the internment for the first time. He said, this is something that took place generations ago, and it's something that we're passionate about, and something that my son will be passionate about, because I took him to an internment camp where we did see the barbed wire fence, and this will be a campaign that our children will be involved in because it's important to our community.
I just hope it'll come back in November and get it done before Christmas, because if it doesn't happen by then, both bills are going to go down the toilet.
There were good people in all parties. But every single one of those parties, in power anyway, said one thing when they weren't in power, and when we actually came back when they got to power, oh, well, no.
Chrétien promised it throughout the election, right? When you first started. Martin just about signed. He wouldn't do it, Actually, Harper really didn't give a shit out of it, tell you the truth.
If it wasn't for the members of Parliament in the House of Commons who came together and worked together through all the different stages, that bill would have never passed.
Bill C-331, an act to recognize the injustice that was done to persons of Ukrainian descent and other Europeans. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Carried.
It passed the Senate in the third day after it left the House and was proclaimed law. It was just an absolute miracle.
It was the product of negotiations with 14 different cabinet ministers in succession, 15 director generals in various parts of the federal government, 3 different Canadian prime ministers, actually 4 from the outset in order for that agreement to occur. That we finally had a chance to have Canadians put something in place permanent that hallows the memory of the internees.
And I'm really proud to be a part of Bill C-331, which is an act to acknowledge that persons of Ukrainian origin were interned in Canada during the First World War, and to provide for recognition of this event.
I think that there's a satisfaction in knowing that we've carried out our obligation to those people who couldn't do it for themselves.
They confiscated all their belongings, and to this very day, really, none of it was returned.
I remember my Guido told people he lost the land, and everybody would say he lost it in a poker match. So now to look back and to know that he lost the land for another reason, but he couldn't tell the reason why, either as being an immigrant, I find that must have been an absolute hell for a man to have to jeopardize his pride.
We did a calculation, and if you were to translate what was taken from those internees into today's dollars, you'd be close to $100 million of assets that were taken from these individuals.
The value of the internees' labor alone in 1991 dollars would be worth something like $30 million. So the government enriched itself, municipalities enriched themselves, provincial governments enriched themselves, various businesses enriched themselves.
And the Ukrainian Canadian community, who really led this campaign on behalf of the other affected communities, never asked for individual compensation. never asked for the descendants of the internment to receive some sort of compensation. No, it was a question about memory. It was a question about ensuring that the proper history was told and that the lessons from that history could help in the establishment of stronger Canadian values.
Oh my gosh.
You might be standing here for this plaque unveiling and thinking, it's wonderful that we're thanking the YMCA, it's wonderful that we've done all this work, but clearly we still haven't won that recognition. We still have not gotten that official acknowledgement. We still not have received what we hope to through Bill C-31.
It's one thing to have recognition. The other is we needed to ensure that Canada was going to commit to educate and commemorate the First World War internment operations. And this is where the next phase of the campaign started, to seek some sort of a settlement.
Once the bill is passed, then it's the government has to look at compensation packages. So as long as I was still a member of Parliament, I was still involved. But by the time it changed, the government had changed after that.
Prime Minister Harper was elected, and we started to work with members of the Conservative caucus, in particular Secretary of State Jason Kenney. And he came to appreciate and understand this part of history and became a strong advocate for us. He then became the Minister of Multiculturalism and really helped us work with public servants to establish something that was meaningful.
In that building in 2008, the Honorable Jason Kenney, Andrew Hladishevsky, representing the Ukrainian Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko, Paul Grod, the President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and I, as a representative of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, signed an accord with the Government of Canada, providing funding for the establishment of the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund.
$10 million was transferred to the Shevchenko Foundation in perpetuity. Thus began a 15-year mandate to fund initiatives related to the commemoration of Canada's first national internment operations.
We were fortunate that the Taras Shevchenko Foundation at that point had been around now for several decades and had a very strong reputation and was able to be that administration.
Again, its prime purpose was education. Basically tell the story. That's what it was, to make sure that the story stays alive.
So I've been involved with the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund since its formation as a representative of the Croatian community on the board, and now currently as its chairman, to make sure that members of each of the affected communities, which included Croatians, Slovenians, Austrians, Czechs, Slovaks, Bulgarians, Romanians, Alevi Kurds, Armenians, among others, but it was important to give those people a voice.
When I first came here, it was a reconnaissance mission with the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund. The irony of this grave right here, of Tom Rutsick, is that he died on October 5th, 1918, and the camp closed on October 21st, 1918. To have been in prison for these 3 years and pass away right before the camp closes is a sad story to me.
There are injustices which are evident at the time that they're being done.
Within the story of internment, there are a number of exceptional people who saw what was happening as being against fundamental natural justice. It's the story of 2 American diplomats, in effect, who went out of their way to inform their governments about the developments here in Canada and said that something needed to be done. These were exceptional individuals. Consul General Gebhard Wilrich and Consul William Bradley. In the case of Gebhard Wilrich, Consul General in Quebec City, the Canadian government at the time had indicated that this was an individual who was interfering in domestic matters and sought to have him dismissed. He was dismissed, but not before ultimately doing only what was right, what was necessary. He's one of the great unsung heroes of the story of internment during the Great War.
In 2010, the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund launched a campaign called What's in Your Trunk across Canada, asking people to look in their trunks for documentation, anything that relates to the internment. What I didn't do was look in my own family's trunk. We found my grandfather's passport, but amongst the passport was his Canadian citizenship paper that he received and a couple little pieces of paper that were folded up. These were our grandparents' registration cards as enemy aliens, and I was stunned. I don't know why didn't I know about it? Why wasn't it talked about? And then actually to find out later on that it actually happened to my family, I was angry. I was really angry after all that time that this could happen in this beautiful country. I'm dug in to try to help people understand that this is wrong. That's why I make this such an important part of my world, is educating others.